All right, welcome back to Yahoo Finance Live on this Wednesday morning. First quarter earnings season has come and gone. We're now a couple weeks out from second quarter earnings season. Wedged in the middle there, as always, is Nike. The company is set to come out with its latest quarterly results tomorrow after the closing bell. Joining us now to talk about what to expect from the retailer is Simeon Siegel, Managing Director, Senior Analyst over at BMO. Simeon, always great to have you on. So let's just talk about how you are seeing the quarter set up for Nike and really where they're at in their life cycle, their transformation. They've had a C-suite change. They've had a major shift to D2C as part of their business. And also they've favorably ridden a lot of these pandemic trends.
Yeah, great to see you guys. And time is relative. I can't figure out if Nike is at the beginning or the end of an earnings cycle. It's a little bit depressing one way or another. But I think it's a great question because here you have the largest seller of retail products in the history of time, essentially, coming in that has really shown us this phenomenal ability to go global and the phenomenal ability to transcend what for everyone else in the retail world has been this ubiquity block. Most companies, when they hit a certain size, they lose their brand cachet. Nike is able to take their limited launches and transpose them into selling much lower price sneakers in every other retail establishment. So I think they're going through this interesting lifestyle change where they're now saying, okay, we can pull back wholesale, own the brand a little bit more through our own channels, elevate the product across the board, but still make sure we're catering to everyone. So you're going to have this interesting period here where tomorrow we're going to hear all of that vis-a-vis North America, Europe, et cetera. But by the same token, we cannot ignore the fact that China, for the first time in a long time, is going to be disappointing. So I think the big question tomorrow is going to be how temporary is the perception of any block in China versus what does the rest of the collective Nike trajectory look like?
Simeon, glad you mentioned China because that brand and some others in the retail space have been swept up into these protests. Now, has that business in Nike for Nike in China, has that bottomed?
It's an interesting question because it's beyond the scope of the brand and it's more geopolitical. So as we think about what's happening, there have been a lot of third-party data that have tracked very low results at Tmall. Tmall has been a very important part of Nike's China story. So do I think it's bottomed? I don't know, right? I think that the reality is the China story, I don't think is going to be structural and long-term. But I also don't think it's just going to be, let's snap our fingers and everything is back. And remember, I mean, Brian, you and I have talked about this all the time. China is has been such an increasing part of both Nike's sales, but perhaps even more importantly of its profits. It's a much more profitable region. So I think tomorrow, I think the headline, listen, you know, I'm a bull, you know, I like this from the long-term perspective. I think what they have done, what they continue to do is somewhat unsurpassed. But I think the reality is we all need to acknowledge that a headline tomorrow is going to be China. And the question is how bad and how long? That's going to be the reality that we're working through. I think everyone knows that. I can tell you all my investor conversations start with how bad is China going to be tomorrow? But the question then is going to be, okay, so looking beyond, is this the brand? Is there anything that changes your view of the brand, of what this brand has been able to accomplish? I think that answer is going to be no. I think we're going to still look at this power that's able to transcend a lot of both. I mean, think of everyone who buys Nikes. It's beyond politics. It's beyond race. It's beyond demographic. So I think that that's ultimately going to be the biggest question. I don't think that one's going to be challenged, while we have to just internalize that from a regional perspective, there's definitely going to be a conversation to be had.
And Simeon, to your point, really what you're talking about is just the utter dominance of Nike over the past, call it decade, really solidified in the past 5 years. And also to your point, it sort of appeals to everyone from, you know, across the age spectrum, across the race and ethnicity spectrum, has a lot of fashion forward offerings that sneakerheads want. Is there anyone out there right now in terms of other brands that are chipping away or that you're watching to, you know, at all challenge that dominance?
So here's what's fascinating. We've spoken on this program throughout the past year and a half about there's certain brands that are becoming really compelling or have become really compelling stocks, specifically because they were shrinking to grow. That's not Nike. So the interesting story is there's a lot of companies that have emerged and we're seeing these one-offs. I think there was another one launched today, I think I saw, from a former Nike athlete that are starting their own lines of footwear. I think that competition across apparel and footwear is not something that is new. So Nike has been able to drive forward. Obviously, there's a few really strong powerhouses. Nike sits atop. But I think that competition's healthy. I think they would agree that competition's healthy. Whether they are chipping off from each other, or perhaps the bigger conversation is, as we go back to work, what does the new uniform look like? Do the Nikes of the world actually start competing against traditional apparel? So did COVID actually expand the pie for anything athletic and athleisure, so that the reality is it's not a battle of Nike versus Under Armour, but it's a conversation of how much share Nike, Lulu, Under Armour, et cetera, how much do they take from the broader wallet? Is this just going to become a normal attire for everyone? And I know there's a thought out there that this is going to be the roaring 20s. We're all going to be wearing tuxedos with tails again. I don't know that I subscribe to that. So I think that that's going to be this dynamic where there's going to be a lot of people still figuring out how to sell sweatpants and sneakers. Does that chip away at Nike, or is there just a broader appetite for it? I tend to be in the latter camp.
Yeah, well, Simeon, as I think about going back to the office, I know that my Lulu 5-pocket ABC pants will be part of that uniform. So I guess that counts. On this topic, I wanted to double click on the footwear point, because the performance versus casual breakdown has been so interesting for Nike in the last couple of years. And you bring up Under Armour, which tried to make a big play, has made a big play into footwear, and from my opinion, it just hasn't worked to the extent the company wanted it to. What does that portfolio look like? I mean, do individual players still drive sales the way that Nike, expects them to? Is it still all about, the sneakers app and what's happening with Jordan Brand? How do you think about the footwear side of it for the company?
Yeah, Miles, it's such a great question, because there's this idea, listen, from a silhouette perspective, I mean, Under Armour did not catch up. I think collectively, externally, internally, I think they would agree that they didn't achieve everything they wanted to achieve, especially considering who they had repping their brand. So having Steph repping their brand, I think they were looking for a larger runway. But that said, $1 billion footwear business is nothing to be ashamed of. So I think that the reality here is the question of what are people, how large is large, how high is this ongoing conversation. I think we will continue to see stars endorse product. I think that the reality is figuring out how to use a LeBron or a Steph Curry to tell people you can be like Mike, right? At the end of the day, by simply buying a pair of $50 to $150 pairs of sneakers has been some of the beauty of this business. There is a reason that the athletic players all spend 10 to 12% of sales on marketing. That's not the same level. That's not in traditional retail. That is the price of entry, because there's so much of the story. Nike, in addition to being one of the top seller of consumer products, is also probably one of the best marketers in the world. So I think that becomes part of that story of telling me, what do these shoes do for me? And using a superstar to do that has been effective. I think will continue to be effective for a very long time. So I think you'll have this concentration of very strong players. You'll have on the other side of the barbell, the emerging, whether it's comfort, we think about the Allbirds of the world, whether it's just different startups. I think there's room for all of them. And I think the question is, how do they tell their story to resonate with that end consumer?
Simeon, switching gears a bit, I have a story on the Yahoo Finance homepage now looking at the rise in American Eagle's Aries Intimates business. Now, the stock has been up about 8% the past 2 days after Brooke Shields posted a photo on her Instagram account in Aerie bathing suits with her two daughters. And I think it just highlights how far that brand has come. My question to you is, why is Aerie still a part of American Eagle, and should it be spun off?
Wow, that's a curveball. I like the question. Listen, I think that there's plenty of room. You could probably make the argument both directions, right? This notion of some of the parts became just as prevalent as my notion of shrinking to grow over COVID. So figuring out companies being able to really, for the first time in a long time, be allowed to take a surgical approach to their portfolios, decide what they want to keep versus what they want to put on the block. So I think last year was the year to do that. I think they would say there are synergies in terms of those two brands. So the overlap versus what they can share, I think the reality is a lot of those stores are still actually side by side. So they've been moving away. They've been opening up their own, not unlike trends we saw with Victoria's Secret and Pink several years ago. But I think that the reality is Aerie has been growing pre-pandemic as well. So they hit on the theme, they hit on reality, right? Aerie Real had been an early campaign that Victoria's Secret is now backing into. And the reality is that share that Victoria's Secret is donating is probably being picked up by Aerie. in a very healthy way. So whether they're separate or not, I think we continue to see Aerie strength. I think the question is if you can get American Eagle stable with Aerie strength, that's not a bad proposition together. And that's been that story. So I think that's a margin. There are worse things in the world than having nice cash generative businesses that can then be further boosted by a hyper growth segment. The flip side of all that, obviously, we finally this week got the Victoria's Secret Bath & Body Works spin announcement. So that was finally, or the filing. So now that's very much moving forward for the conversation that we've been having for a very long time. So we are seeing certain companies realize or appreciate that they can unlock value from a stock market perspective and an operational perspective if they're separate. But I would argue that Victoria's Secret lingerie and Bath & Body Works scented candles are much further apart than American Eagle and Aerie.
Simeon, Val's noting in our Slack that we can't have you on the program without Victoria's Secret coming up at least one time. So I know we'll have you back. I know we'll do more Victoria's Secret and L Brands in the future. Simeon Siegel, thanks for jumping on and talk a little bit about Nike's report tomorrow, American Eagle, and everything else happening in retail. Always appreciate it. We'll be in touch.